Okay, in this video, we'll continue to review some key questions from chapter 4. So, first of all, if you get asked to explain why households and businesses are both buyers and sellers in the economy, it's important to talk about both household and resource markets. So, essentially, in resource markets, households are sellers, they sell their labour resources, and businesses are buyers. Whereas in the product market, households are buyers and producers are sellers. So in the product market, that's one we normally talk about, which is just buying and selling goods and services. Businesses sell and consumers buy. But in resource markets, it's the households that sell their resources, their land, labour and capital, and it's businesses that buy. What is meant by resource markets and what is the aim of both businesses and households in the resource market? So resource markets are markets in which businesses give money in exchange for land, labour and capital. And households spend this income on goods and services produced by businesses. But that happens in product markets. So the resource market is where the household sector sells land, labour and capital to businesses. What is the aim? The aim of businesses is to acquire resources which will allow them to produce goods and services profitably, whilst the aim of consumers is to generate an income. So basically what it's asking you is what is the aim in the labour market? Households want to generate income. Businesses want to get valuable employees that are going to help them to produce goods and services profitably. So next thing is the aggregate demand curve and demand factors. First thing you need to be aware of is why the demand curve slopes downwards. So what are two reasons why the level of aggregate demand falls when prices increase? So this is talking about the slope. Two reasons are the wealth effect and the international competitiveness effect. So when the price is high in Australia, if we assume prices overseas stay the same, we become less internationally competitive. And because of that, at higher prices, we export less and we import more, and that reduces aggregate demand. So one reason demand is lower at higher prices is because we're less internationally competitive. And secondly, when we have higher average prices, the purchasing power of savings goes down. So any given savings that people have are now worth less. So essentially when prices are higher, people feel poorer because their real wealth has gone down, and that generally leads to a fall in consumption spending. The second thing is that people generally spend less because they feel less wealthy, and that's as a result of the fact that their money's not worth as much. Okay, now we're talking about factors that will shift the demand curve. So how the following factors will shift the aggregate demand. So changes in real disposable income. Make sure you've got a really strong definition of real disposable income because there's not a lot to talk about here. So it's important that you first define it in detail. So real disposable income is gross income, income from your job plus any welfare, plus less any government direct taxation. So basically, after you pay income tax, and because we're talking about real here, it's adjusted for inflation. Your income from your job plus welfare minus any direct taxes or after your income tax, and it's also been adjusted for inflation. When real disposable income increases, it means income after tax has increased once you've adjusted for inflation as well, and therefore people have more purchasing power. So real disposable income, it's gone down slightly in recent years. I know this question's a bit outdated, but it's gone down slightly. And as a result of that, people don't have as much spending power, and that can lead to a reduction in consumption spending throughout the economy. Slower overseas growth rates. So if Japan and China and America, our major trading partners, fall, their growth falls, then there's less demand for our exports. So, for example, China recently have moved away from investment spending, and that's had a negative impact on the demand for our exports, particularly our minerals, our coal and iron ore, which leads to reduction in exports, which then flows on to less profits for businesses and less income for citizens, which reduces consumption and investment as well. And that flows on to reduced aggregate demand, slows the economy down. Okay, explain the impact higher interest rates can have on aggregate demand. In your answer, make reference to two reasons why higher interest rates reduce both C and I. So two reasons for each of them. An increase in interest rates, the first reason it slows consumption spending is consumers have less discretionary income. So what that means is people that have variable rate loans will now be paying more off their mortgages, which leaves them for less money to spend on other goods and services. So that's your first reason. So there's a mark in it for that. Your second reason is that higher interest rates also increase the cost of borrowing for consumers, which makes them more reluctant to go into debt, which will also lead to less consumption on things like cars and boats and houses and things like that. And there's also more incentive to save because you get a higher return. So they're two separate reasons. One, people spend less because they have less discretionary income. And two, people who are thinking of taking out a loan are more reluctant to do so because they know they're going to have higher interest rates or higher borrowing costs. So they're less likely to buy that car or that boat or spend on the credit card and they're also more likely to save. So they're your two reasons why it reduces consumption. In terms of investment spending, businesses who already have loans will now have to pay back more, so they'll have less cash flow and less profits to invest in capital and equipment, so that'll slow down investment spending. And two, higher interest rates means that they're less willing to borrow in the future as well, because it's going to cost them more to pay back. Well, the borrowing costs associated with any future investment is also higher. So they're your two reasons why consumption falls. One, we have less discretionary income. Two, we borrow less. Investment spending falls is the same reasons. One, those who already have loans are have less money to invest and less cash flow. And two, they're less likely to take on any additional loans for any future investment projects. With reference to the circular flow model, explain how depreciation of the dollar is likely to increase injections and decrease leakages from the Australian economy. In your answer, refer to import competing firms. There's a lot to do here. So talk about how depreciation of the dollar impacts the circular flow, mention injections and leakages, which is going to be your imports and exports, and also mention import competing firms. So depreciation of the dollar is likely to lead to an increase in the demand for Australian exports. This will mean that foreign currencies have more purchasing power to buy Australian goods and services, which is likely to boost demand for exports like tourism and education. Firms involved in exporting commodities also generate more income when the dollar's low. This leads to an increase in exports and a decrease in imports because the price of imports will be more expensive, which will help to increase injections and reduce leakages from the Australian economy. So see how we've made reference there to leakages and injections in the circular flow. The other thing you need to say is that Australian import competing firms, I think I've missed out on this here. Australian import competing firms will also be more competitive because we're more likely to buy Australian made as opposed to foreign products. This is likely to boost aggregate demand, boost production, create more income, and reduce unemployment throughout the economy. Okay, how does an increase in consumer confidence impact marginal propensity to consume and aggregate demand? So higher consumer confidence means that consumers on average are more confident about their future earning potential. This can be due to strong employment prospects, media reports of strong economic conditions overseas. Marginal propensity to consume measures the increase in consumption that will result from a $1 increase in disposable income. Higher consumer confidence leads to a higher marginal propensity to spend and less propensity to save, boosting consumption spending. This increased spending is likely to boost aggregate demand and boost production throughout the economy. So marginal propensity to spend increases because we're more confident in our future earning potential, therefore more likely to spend our money as opposed to save. Okay, in this question, we're talking about what happens to economic activity, or basically our GDP, and price levels when there's an increase in aggregate demand. And it asks you to explain the concept of productive capacity. So it's really important to understand the different impact that aggregate demand has on the economy, depending on where we are in relation to our productive capacity. So the impact of an increase in demand will have on economic activity, and the price level depends on where a country is working in relation to its productive capacity. If capacity utilization rates are low, so it means we're a long way from our productive capacity, then we can easily lift output when demand increases. So that's like similar to what the economy is now. We're a long way from our productive capacity, so if demand was to increase, we'd easily be able to supply more. This would cause large increases in production and boost economic activity without causing inflation. We have plenty of resources to meet the demand, so it's not likely to cause inflation. But once we get close to our productive capacity, which is evidenced by the more vertical part of the aggregate supply curve, it's harder to boost production because resources are stretched, and any increase in aggregate demand may just lead to more higher prices and have minimal impact on economic activity. Once we reach our productive capacity, increases in aggregate demand are effectively useless and will only lead to increased inflation. All our resources are fully employed. Okay, so try and mention the three phases in your answer. If we're at low capacity utilization, the horizontal section, increased aggregate demand will lead to more production. Intermediate section will have some impact, but will also lead to higher prices. At our productive capacity, it won't help to boost economic activity. Explain how output and prices respond to the increase in aggregate demand. It's pretty much a similar question. Prices and output will generally increase. Firms will increase the output levels to boost real GDP. If we're close to our productive capacity, then aggregate demand is only likely to lead to higher prices, but may not increase output if there's no resources to meet demand. Explain why a large increase in demand may have minimal impact on output, or basically if we're at our productive capacity, we're working on the vertical section of the aggregate supply curve, resources are limited, any increase in demand is going to lead to bottlenecks in production and capacity constraints. which occurs when we're close to our productive capacity, rather than generating an increased economic growth. Aggregate supply. Okay, a couple of key important terms. Make sure you've got a really strong definition of productive capacity. So when the economy has reached the point where it's supplying at its maximum possible at that point in time, all resources are fully employed. We're not always working at our productive capacity. Okay? Capacity utilization rates refers to the extent to we're working to our full capacity. So when we have low capacity utilization rates, we're basically, on this horizontal part where we've got lots of spare resources, and high capacity utilization occurs towards our productive capacity when we're on the more vertical section. Okay, why is the supply curve upward sloping? Basically because higher prices provide the extra lure or incentive for producers to supply more. So when a country is close to its productive capacity, and resources are scarce, businesses need the incentive of higher prices to help cover their costs and incentivize them to produce more. Why does it have three sections? Refer to capacity constraints in your answer. So it has three sections because the availability of resources differs depending on the level of demand. When demand is weak, businesses have many idle resources and can easily increase output, so they don't even need to raise prices. So that's why the supply curve is horizontal, because even if demand increases, they're going to produce more even if prices don't go up. So what that means in practical terms is, like, if we say now when the economy is going really poorly because of the virus, if there was suddenly an increase in demand, firms are unlikely to increase prices. There's no need for them to. What they prefer is just to sell more and hire more employees. So even if there was more demand, prices are unlikely to increase. In the intermediate zone, businesses are likely to experience some capacity constraints and may need to pay overtime and things like that. So they have the lure of higher prices to increase production. In the vertical zone, an economy is at their productive capacity, so there's no spare resources. So even if demand increases, all it's going to lead to is higher prices. Higher demand will just cause bottlenecks and queues, and will limit our ability because we don't have that ability to supply anymore. Okay, why is it horizontal when we have spare capacity? Because in this range, producers have significant spare capacity. There is significant idle resources and capital resources. It's easy for firms to expand production when there's more demand, so they're unlikely to raise their prices when there's more demand. They'll simply increase production levels to generate more employment. They don't need to raise their prices. Why the intermediate zone is upward sloping? Because resources are scarce, so capacity constraints are starting to emerge. So unless firms get a higher price, they won't produce more. So very similar to the micro curve, which is just linear. Unless they get the higher price, firms aren't willing to supply more. They may need to buy more machinery, pay workers overtime. So unless they get the incentive of higher prices, they won't increase production. Shifts in aggregate supply. Okay. It says explain how an increase in aggregate supply might contribute to an increase in the rate of economic growth. This is a past exam question which students struggled with. They struggled to explain the relationship between aggregate supply and economic growth. You need to explain clearly. The good answers explain that aggregate supply refers to the total volume of goods and services we're willing and able to produce. Those two words are really important. Increased aggregate supply can occur as a result of improved profitability. Increased aggregate supply can result from improved quantity or quality of resources, which helps to boost our productive capacity and our ability to produce, which allows us to meet demand without any excessive inflation. Okay, so aggregate supply is really important for maintaining healthy economic activity. An economy needs to boost the quantity and quality of its resources so it can meet any increase in demand without experiencing inflation. We need to keep the two in balance. When demand increases, we need to boost supply as well. Otherwise, we're going to just experience inflation. So this will help to ensure the economy is able to remain internationally competitive and that we don't get too close to our productive capacity. Balanced growth by investing in productivity, education, technology is essential for our long-term economic prosperity. Okay, without boosting our supply potential, we can't meet demand and we're likely to experience high levels of inflation. Explain how output and prices respond in the event of an increase in aggregate supply. So an increase in aggregate supply means we're boosting our supply potential or productive capacity, which means we can produce more goods and services without causing inflation. So an increase in supply will lead to a boost in economic activity and international competitiveness and lead to greater levels of output as well as reduced prices. How does a shift in aggregate supply lead to increased unemployment? To the left, basically it means producers are less willing to produce, which means it also leads to higher prices, which makes us less internationally competitive.